There are stories told today by cultures in Siberia and the Americas about mammoths. But these stories, were they created at a time when humans saw mammoths alive? If they can, then these mammoth stories could be thousands of years old or tens of thousands of years old. But if not, then are these stories pointless? Are they of any value to us? And that is the question I will answer today, whether we have stories from that time that show humans witnessing mammoths alive, or if not, what's the point of these stories? And why am I telling you this? Because my name is John White and I'm a researcher of comparative mythology. And if this sounds interesting to you, then, well, please like and subscribe to my channel, support me on YouTube and Patreon. And with that, grab yourself a cup of tea and we're going to go looking for some mammoths. And, well, welcome to Krakenford. Let's start our journey in Siberia. Imagine it is late spring and the snow is melting, and more importantly, so is the permafrost. Every year it melts a little more and the water flows, forming scars through the muddy landscape, and riverbanks form, and as the riverbanks form, something unusual appears out of them. Something's uncovered, and it is the colour of old teeth, though much larger, as long as a person, and it's curved. And for us, we can recognise these things as mammoth's tusks. But imagine you find one of these a couple of thousand years ago, and you have no concept of extinction, and you have never seen a mammoth or even an elephant. You have no context of what this is. You have no knowledge of geology or deep history. There aren't museums or textbooks or any frameworks in which you can comprehend that an animal no longer exists anywhere on Earth. So you have this tusk in the mud on a riverbank. How do you explain it? That is not a rhetorical question. People had this challenge repeatedly across northern Eurasia and North America for a very long time, and they answered it in ways that made sense at the time. And some of these answers survive today. They were written down by travellers and traders and later ethnographers and antiquarians, and these answers can be strange, but also weirdly specific, and in their own ways, the context they were noted were rather brilliant. And so if we look at those answers, we can understand if humans actually first encountered mammoths that were alive. And are the stories we're hearing about them based on these living creatures? Well, I think that concept is really seductive. That's why people watch my channel, to understand some of these old stories and how far back do they go. And there is some folklore in Siberia, that runs back. And what we want to know is, does that run back to a hunter seeing a mammoth in the cold? Did he watch it breathe, live, and, I don't know, run through rivers and eat grass and do whatever mammoths do? Now, I'm going to start this research with the answer. And that is that it is almost certainly not the case that that is true, that we have stories that go back to someone who saw a living mammoth. But do not be disappointed, for what I'm going to argue is actually considerably far more interesting than that. But if you have thoughts, if you want to challenge anything I say, just put questions or challenges in the comments. Make them polite, please. And if they are, I will most certainly read them and almost certainly reply to them. I'll do my best anyway. Now, the material I want to talk about can be divided into two categories. And these categories are regularly confused, including by many popular writers on this subject. And I will mention both these categories now, but I'll deal with them separately in the video for reasons which will become clear. Now, the first concept is about depicting mammoths. We know human beings lived alongside mammoths, and we know that those who did drew them, carved them, engraved them. This is without dispute, undisputed. Humans saw mammoths and they recorded how they looked. It is not a mystery. It is eyewitness art. When you look at these mammoth drawings and engravings, and there's two great examples are in the caves at Ustiga and Chevaux in France, we are looking at the work of people who had seen the animal. There is no memory involved. This is an observation. Now, the second category is best described as explanation. For example, long after the mammoth disappeared from the Siberian landscape, thousands of years after, people were encountering its remains, its tusks and teeth in these riverbanks, and they had to construct various accounts to try and work out why these things were left in the mud and permafrost. These accounts created folklore, stories made by the people to describe the things in the world around them, why they were as they were. But also, in a way, you could consider this the science at the time, how these explanations were put together. Now, for me, it is the confusion seen between these two categories, between depicting and explanation, where nearly every bad version of research goes wrong. Ancient humans remembered mammoths collapses into this one thing of merging these two together, and yet they are not one thing. The gap between depictions and explanations could be thousands of years. But this gap is where interesting things happen, where folklore lives, where stories that humans create live, where stories perceive the world around them. So where do we start finding this out? Well, the clearest attestations and the most attestations of the mammoth come from northern Siberia. So let's start there and start with why we call it a mammoth. Now, the mammoth is obviously the English version of the name. In some local Siberian languages, they call it kosher. In others, the Mansi, for example, they call it Mangdont, which seems to be the closest cognate to mammoth and means ground horn, relating to tusks being found in the ground. And it is thought that Mangdont probably became Mammoth and then Mammoth, and from there it's a really short step to Mammoth. And because this term was used a lot in the trade of ivory in Siberia down to China and along the Silk Road into eventually into Europe, the name persisted. Now, in northern Siberia, the mammoth was often thought to be a creature that lived underground, which to us may seem crazy. There's this big animal, how does it live underground? And some traditions even said it was the guardian of the underworld. So this underground attribute associated with this big woolly beast wasn't a metaphor. This was said in the same physical sense that you would give a mole you give to a mole living underground. These people believed that the mammoth was an animal that spent its life burrowing through the frozen earth, moving through ground like a fish through water. It had never been seen alive by anyone because it could not survive exposure to air and light, and to come to the surface of the ground was, for this animal, fatal. Now, where did this come from? Well, the earliest widely cited European report of this belief comes from Eberhard Ysbrants-Ides, who was a Dutch-born trader and merchant who travelled overland via Moscow to China as an envoy for Peter the Great in the 1690s. Ides recorded that the Evenki, Yakut and Ostyak peoples believed that a creature, the one we know today as a mammoth, lived beneath the ground, moving around back and forth, and that exposure to the air killed it, or almost always killed it, was his actual words, I think. And I'll reference everything in these books and papers I mentioned below if you want to understand where I got this information from. But that would explain why the animal was only known for its remains. It could not survive on the open ground. And so think about that for a moment, which it sounds preposterous today that an animal lived like that. But back then that was a really genuinely good piece of reasoning, considering everything they knew about this animal at the time. This is folklore, stories before science, and it came into existence as there were consistent animal remains in enormous quantities found in the ground. Absolutely nothing at all on the ground, and no living creatures to go with them. In the stories from Siberia, there were no people who had seen them alive. Nobody's parents had seen them alive. Nobody's grandparents had seen them alive. Yet these tusks kept appearing, and they appeared out of the ground, around riverbanks, thawing slopes, the collapsing terrain, all revealed these. The remains were not lying on the surface where a dead animal would lie. They were coming up from below, and so it makes sense to these people that the animal must live in the ground below them. Now, seeing this, and also having no concept of extinction, the folklore of the people in Siberia is that it must be a subterranean animal that dies when it surfaces. And that is not superstition, it is a hypothesis about the animal. It accounts for the evidence. It is falsifiable in principle. It even makes a prediction that you will therefore never see a live mammoth. And that was true from the moment that prediction was made. Now, today, we know that hypothesis is wrong. It was, by all means, reasonable inference from the data, but unbeknown to them, their data was incomplete. But I also want to be careful not to over-romanticize this, because I'm not claiming that these people were trying to be scientific. They were creating a mythology and folklore around what they were seeing, and that can sort of inverse a science, but they didn't have a framework of systematic testing. The inferential structure is there, and it deserves to be named, but rather than patronized, you shouldn't laugh at them for coming up with these ideas. But as I say, this kind of folklore, mythology, if you will, you want to be a little more specific about it, to these people, their mythology shows this acting process. And if you want to read more about this mythology begetting the science, then Karl Popper's book on Conjectures and Refutations is well worth a read. But this view of mammoths coming from the underground was also not the view everywhere. And the variations are interesting and explain more about how people found the tusks. So, for those not familiar with my work, one of the things I do is curate a folklore database, a collection of hundreds of thousands of narratives, of lots of metadata, geospatial information, and all this work is supported by my patrons and YouTube members. And a big thank you to them. And this support allows us to do many other things, including search for where mammoths appear in stories. And this map shows narratives from the database and where they appear. And they appear across Siberia and into the Americas. And these link to the spread of the subterranean mammoth and some of the stories we hear about it. And these migrated across different areas of Siberia, and we can map them against linguistic groupings to understand how myths slowly change. But when it comes to the Selkup tradition of the mammoths, the story does change. It was given a purpose, this place in the underground, because it guarded the underworld rather than it was just an animal that was like a big mole in a way. And this perception of the guardian of the underworld I see a number of times. And many of the references seem to be second or third hand. I have found a primary reference at last, and it comes from some work of Prokof'eva in 1948, a book called in English The Mammoth in Selkup Traditions. It isn't well attested, but hopefully we can uncover more evidence to support this interesting view. In fact, let me read the passage he writes about the Selkup mammoth tradition, because it is quite interesting. The Selkups believed that a huge, powerful animal, the kosher, lived underground. The Selkups also knew the word kosher amdi, meaning mammoth horn. In their ancient fairy tales, the hero's bow was made of mammoth horn, and Tamar was an arrow with a round tip made of mammoth horn. Apparently, according to Selkup beliefs, the mammoth, like the elk or deer, possessed horns. It was seen as an animal that guarded the entrance to the underworld, the guardian of the dead, or guardian of the land of the dead. These people also have the bear as an animal which guarded the land of the dead, as the bear was the main spirit of the underground. The image of the underground mammoth is closely related to that of the bear. The Selkups didn't only call the underground mammoth bear Mammoth. According to Selkup beliefs, the remote lakes of the Sima River Basin, rarely visited by hunters, were also home to kosher fishmits, mammoth pike. These fish are very old and large and covered in moss from old age. These pike were known to steal fish from the fishing tackle set out by the Selkup on the lake and could even kill a person. Fermented bread was offered to these fish as an offering, and these lakes were said to be the Devil's Lakes, where the mammoth lives. This is fascinating to me as it raises two other mythological animal types, the mammoth bear and the mammoth pike. The bear was actually the principal spirit of the underworld, probably in part to its ferocity, and it lived in caves, which we often see as entrances to the underworld. And so that part of the connection to the mammoth may be why the mammoth too was put in that position. The pike, that's really interesting. You know, these are predators of rivers and lakes, of fish-eating fish, and so behaved in a way that could be associated with death, and perhaps that's the reason there, and also being quite large. Now, what isn't mentioned here was one other animal we see associated with the mammoth, and which is considered the mammoth's helper, and that is the otter, sometimes called locally in these regions a mammoth. Now, there is a paper, again I'll link it below, about shamanic imagery of the mammoth, which not only mentions Prokof'eva's work, but has another fascinating detail if you're interested in fairy folklore, and that is that the shamanic costumes of the time, they included iron figures known as Mylak, and these Mylak were said to enclose spirits within them. And this is really interesting because the fairies of the West usually do not like iron at all. They fear it, they hate it. And so I wonder if there's a connection or a reflex here. And it seems unlikely due to distance and time, although I mean, there may be some keen folklorists who may want to do some research about that. But it was said that these figures were sacrificed, so in effect votive offerings. And one story has it that an iron figure of a swan was sacrificed to a spirit during the illness of a family member, and also due to another's misfortune to appease the spirit. And everyone had their own Mylak. It could be a game bird, a grouse, for example. But in the descriptions we see here, the research showed that one was an eagle with an unbent neck and a swan with a bent neck. Anyway, let me get back on track. Sorry, there was just some fascinating things there I thought I'd share. So, staying in Siberia and the Yakut tradition, these people's view of the mammoth was more associated with water spirits and appears in some accounts as a horned creature living in rivers capable of breaking the ice. But more about that particular version of the mammoth later. We have a fantastic story coming up. The mammoth in water is not a contradiction of the underground concept, so much as a variant of the same observed fact, because the place where you find most mammoth remains was overwhelmingly on riverbanks, and this is not because mammoths necessarily lived next to rivers a lot, but rivers cut through permafrost when the ice melted, and so these rivers just exposed tusks and bones. And if you are aware, or if you were, let's say, unaware that the landscape changes over time, even if you remain in the same place, then remains which come out of the riverbank were probably assumed to be from an animal of the river, a water animal. Now, there's a fascinating aspect to the water mammoth, and that is found within the Evenki tradition. Here, the mammoth is said to have a role in the creation of the world by dragging land up from the floor of the primordial ocean with its tusks. This, unfortunately, is not a direct quote from Evenki tradition, but it's clearly referenced in secondary works on the Evenki cosmological lore. Now, this story itself is just incredible for a comparative mythologist because it starts with the mammoth and the mythical serpent Bar. Now, the mammoth expanded the initially small earth to create more land, to allow more people to live, and it managed this by swimming to the bottom of the sea, used its tusks to dig out some mud and brought this to the surface, where it became land, and the land grew rapidly, and mountains started to appear. And the mammoth then asked this mythical serpent Dabeda for help, suggesting the serpent should flatten the uneven ground. And as a result, the serpent made the rivers, and the valleys and lakes were made by the mammoth walking on the land. And so you have this landscape falling from the snake and the mammoth. And the mountains remained where they were because they were the untouched part of the growing land. Now, I will pause for a second. And you should think about that story. Mammoth diving, bringing up earth, creating land. Then a snake creating rivers and valleys. Some of you, those who certainly watch my content a lot, will recognise two key creation motifs here, old creation motifs. First, the rainbow serpent, or the rain snake, we've seen in South Africa and Australia, which is carving the landscape, although this snake isn't creating land. And my gut feel is that this is an independent development rather than an evolution and a persistence of the story coming out of Africa. But it really is interesting. But the story that may be a migration and evolution of an older story is the mammoth diving to get earth. That is the earth diver motif, or at least the sub-motif of it. I've spent lots of time discussing the earth diver before, so I won't go over it again. But this is just, it is the right story, just the details change to make sense of things. And it makes sense of why there are these animal bones in the riverbanks. We see variations, say, across the world and in Eastern Europe, where they change it to be another being, like God and the devil, which is a standard change we see across much of Eurasia. Again, I'll put a map up showing the earth diver motif in the various versions from the folklore database. Now, the Siberian version has been obviously established by having this creature reconstructed from the bones in a riverbank, replacing a bird in pre-existing and quite widely used cosmogonic motif. The mammoth did not generate this story. The story was already there, say, across much of Northern Europe and North America, and the mammoth just fitted into it to make the story believable and more relevant to the traditions that are telling it. That is how folklore works, how storytelling works, because it recurs many times. The bones of the mammoth did not create this story. They were absorbed into a story that already existed to make it make more sense. Now, there is one thing about all these descriptions of mammoth that is lacking. Why does the mammoth appear underground in the first place? There needs to be a reason. The mammoth can't be sort of skipping along in the sunshine on the grass and thinks, I want to live underground. There must be a story about that transformation. And we do have a story about that. And that's from the Kenti, and they talk of a creature called the Muffcore, which is interpreted as meaning literally reindeer of the earth, or earth reindeer, but it's probably better interpreted as being a category of cosmological underground animal. The Muffcore was not a sort of a distinct creature. It was a subterranean transformation of an animal, with examples including the elk and the bear and even the pike in some stories. And this process of transformation is assumed to happen as part of an animal's alteration as it gets extremely old. And these animals were said to not die an ordinary death, but instead, when they entered the earth and or the underwater earth, they began a prolonged second existence as this beast, the Muffcore. These Muffcore lived long lives, but they weren't immortal because they need a way to explain the bones and the tusks that are encountered in the ground. They will die eventually. And it is here, at this point, where we have this landscape of mammoths associated with water, with underground, that from northern Siberia, that I think we should change direction a little bit and move elsewhere. In fact, if we move southwards, we can move towards China, and the story changes completely in China because mammoths stop appearing from underground. They don't have the permafrost. They're not in Siberia. Instead, mammoths are known because of the ivory. The ivory is commodity to the people, and so because they're ivory important, it created riches. It's a great material for craft. The Siberian tusks moved down here along the trade routes, and by the time these tusks have arrived at their final destination, the context of where they are from would have changed. Now, what arrived to these places may have been ivory, mammoth ivory, but what didn't arrive with them necessarily was the stories of the riverbanks and the underworld. So what did the traders at these destinations receiving these do? What story did they construct? And the story we find in some Chinese sources was that this northern ivory was associated with a creature described as Tian Shu. And Tian Shu can be interpreted as teeth of the mouse, referring to the unseen mammoth as a giant rodent of the frozen north. Narratives from Manchu tradition describe a beast resembling a mouse but the size of an elephant which burrows beneath the earth and dies when exposed to air and light. It has bright white bones and is found near riverbanks, and its name there was Momentua, which sounds phonetically similar to how mammoth is pronounced in parts of Siberia. So, what's fascinating about that is that after an enormous distance travelled, the same conclusion has been reached about the actions of the animal. These people know this ivory was found coming from the ground, and that the animal probably dies when it hits the ground or the air and the light. And the question to ask is, did that narrative travel with traders from Siberia to China, or did Chinese traders independently create that story? Now, we can't confidently evidence either. My gut feel is that probably some traders took the story from Siberia to China, especially considering some of the details of this story. How do they know about the riverbanks and the air and the light? But we see some other things like giant mouse change again because these people don't have a context of mammoths or elephants or these big woolly creatures. But those parts, the mouse part, that's probably a convergence, a separate story that's come along and joined the story of the underground aspect of it. And so these stories, again, it's folklore. These aren't quaint stories. They're stories to explain what is being found, where it is found, how it is got there. These are practical stories. These are myths, you would almost argue. Now, a story is needed to explain where the ivory came from, and that would have been true of many strange and foreign objects. The thing is that this story seems to have persisted much longer than the others. That's really interesting. So the folklore, about these creatures continue to grow, and it makes you ask, actually, why? What's actually being found or seen or being told? We have touched on the tusks and the teeth, but were other things found? And this is where we can journey to a place called Berelech River in Yakutia, where an absolutely extraordinary quantity of mammoth bones and tusks have been accumulated, so much so that the place is called a mammoth graveyard. Now, it certainly wasn't a graveyard, but it just called that to give you an idea of the amount of bones here. There are thousands of bones representing over hundreds of individual animals, seemingly swept together by deposited water. Now, imagine encountering that scene. Not one tusk, but hundreds of them, from other bones from scores of animals, concentrated all in one place, of a creature nobody has ever seen. And alongside these bones, there were carcasses. Siberia is cold. I mean, you might think things are cold in your refrigerator, but that really is nothing compared to how cold Siberia is. And that cold is so cold the ground freezes deeply that it is in a permanent frost, hence permafrost, and which lasts a really long time, thousands and thousands of years. And not only does it freeze the ground and preserve the bone, it can also preserve parts of the animal, such as the skin and the hair and the flesh, sometimes even the contents of its stomach, which means that some mammoth remains can be found looking as very similar to they did when they died. And one well-known example of this is the Adams mammoth, recovered in 1806 from the Lena Delta. And it was so well preserved and it came out of the ground that there was soft tissue still attached to the bones. And there's a picture of someone who actually saw it, showing what was there. But also think about what that does to the underground mammoth hypothesis. It doesn't falsify it, it confirms it spectacularly, because here is an animal that is not fossilized, it is not stone, it is a creature with hair on it emerging from the earth, and it's dead. Now, of course, it died on contact with the air and daylight. That's how the folklore is. It must have. What further evidence could anyone want? We can easily imagine that pre-scientific explanation was just a failure of observation, people not looking carefully enough and understanding enough. But I feel this is exactly the opposite. The subterranean mammoth hypothesis persisted for centuries because the evidence just kept coming. It was well supported. It survived contact with a great deal of data. And when this idea was eventually upturned, it wasn't because of better observations of mammoths, but because of an entirely new framework of science, the understanding of deep time, extinction, and stratigraphy, which came from outside the ecosystem of the mammoth and the traditions that knew it. It was rendering a different question of the data. Now, that is not just a story of mammoths in myth, but a story about how knowledge actually changes. And I feel it is a far more fascinating story than primitive people believe strange things. Now, some of you at this point may be saying, this is all great, John, but why have you focused on Siberia? What about elsewhere? Mammoths were found in America and Europe. Well, as I said at the start, I've focused on Siberia. It is probably the richest and most coherent research. But the same process ran elsewhere, and that should be no surprise to us. One thing we should do at this point is give a nod to the recognition of a scholar, Adrienne Mayer, whose 2 books he's written on classical Mediterranean and North America, has done more than anyone else to try to establish these pre-modern people thought about fossils, their systematic interpretation of them. And she does so thoughtfully, and she uses the term geomythology, which is a term we see elsewhere, particularly in landscape, creating mnemonic for myth. Patrick Dunn is a really great author who talks about that, certainly, particularly around Australia. Things that happen there in terms of the indigenous Australians and some of the stories they have. But I won't go off topic on that just yet, though I'd like to make a video about his work. It really is interesting. So, yes, changing landscape creates myth, but these things in the landscape also help create myth. And Adrienne argues that across the ancient Mediterranean and across North America, the discovery of large fossil bones fed directly into traditions of giants and monsters and extraordinary creatures. And in North America, she particularly argues that mammoths and mastodon remains sit behind a range of monster bear and water monster and thunderbird traditions. In the classical world, in Europe, the bones of large extinct mammals could plausibly underlie some of the giant traditions of the Cyclops. So what we see is that pygmy elephants on Greek islands, their skulls, where the trunk comes, looks like a big eye socket. And I've discussed this in the Polyphemus video I made a few years ago. And people could suggest that this is a sort of help evidence the Cyclops story. And that is a plausible hypothesis. It could be a contributing factor to the story, but we also have to bear in mind it doesn't demonstrate that that is the origin of the story. It just could be a way to help persist that story, or the story changed to accommodate that. So the Cyclops may have had two eyes. They found a skull and it became one eye, but the Cyclops was still there. And Adrienne is herself really careful on this point, but there are many people who, let's call them populists of her work, who aren't so cautious. And if I take this further, I would say that there is very little evidence that dinosaur bones influenced things like the dragons. Dragons were all sorts of sizes and often no bigger than a pig in medieval European tradition. This idea of the influence is just a hypothesis, and it is plausible, but it doesn't necessarily align with a narrative origin, distribution, and evolution. Not well, in my opinion. But it is worth noting for anyone interested in such things. But I'm still not talking about North America properly, so let me go there and tell you a really interesting story, actually, in a minute. You see, there's a really genuine puzzle here, and it's from the Casca narrative in British Columbia, Canada. And this story is called The Ladder-Headed Boy. So let me tell you this story. And this is originally found a copy in 1917 in the Journal of American Folklore. Again, I'll tweak the story so it makes a bit more sense, but I'll link a reference below. And the story goes like this. A man and his wife and his baby were travelling all the time and catching beaver on the lakes and streams of the countryside. And one day they came to a big lake which they crossed and decided to camp on the other side. They stayed there for a few days, and one of the days the woman was dragging a toboggan laden with beaver meat back to the camp, and her baby was on her back, and she felt that a large animal was approaching her from behind. She was too afraid to look around, and so looked back between her legs, and there she saw an animal that was an atix, which is their word for mammoth, and she was very afraid. She scattered all the beaver meat in the snow and ran to the camp. But she thought her husband would not believe that she had seen this huge animal, and perhaps he would have thought that she's given her meat to another lover. And so she said, when she got back to the camp, she pulled up her clothes and said, "You can see I have been with no man." And her husband laughed and went off to set his beaver nets. Anyway, on his return, he went to bed and was soon sound asleep and snoring. And his wife decided to use this time to cut a trail to escape through the willow brush near the camp if the monster was to turn up. She then lay back down opposite the fire with her husband and with the moccasins on just in case, and a baby in their arms ready to run. And during the night she heard this atix coming, and she poked her husband with a stick to awaken him, but he slept on, snoring. She had no choice but to run away, and the animal came into the camp and ate her husband. And afterwards the animal followed the woman's tracks, making sounds like a person crying. By this time, the woman reached a place on the lake where many people were camped and warned them, "The atix is coming, the atix is coming." The people made many holes close together at the edge of the lake so the animal, in its approach, would break through the ice and drown. And when the animal did arrive eventually, the ice broke with its weight and the animal fell to the bottom of the lake. The animal walked along the bottom of the lake and then broke the ice ahead of him and came out to where the people were. The woman with the baby ran away. The other people were so scared they could not run. They fainted in shock. But in the camp was one boy, a boy who was constantly bullied by everyone. In fact, he was so badly treated that even old women stepped over him and treated him as though he was a dog. He looked different to the others, as though he had no hair. And that was because he wore a moose bladder over his head. People thought he was strange. And in fact, the truth was, he was a shaman. And the only person who knew this was his grandmother. And this boy, he had magic trousers and magic arrows. And it was during this panic, he said to his grandma, look what is coming, get my trousers and my arrows. And he put them on, seized his bow, he jumped up and shook his head, and a bladder burst, and all his hair fell down all over him. And then he released his bow and shot an arrow right through the animal. He then jumped to the other side of the beast and shot another arrow, and he went back and forth a few times until the Attics lay dead. The people were very thankful and gave him 2 girls to be his wives, but he only accepted 1. They made him their chief, and this is why, since that women who run away will always come back again. Now, that is a fascinating story, even if the conclusion is a bit strange to me, but it is fascinating nonetheless. Now, what really is interesting about this description is given to the animal called the Atex, and in the Journal of American Folklore, there is a note at the bottom of the page, and it says this. It says that the Atex is a very large kind of animal which roamed the country a long time ago. It corresponded somewhat to white men's pictures of elephants. It was of huge size. It built like an elephant, had tusks, and was hairy. These animals were seen not so very long ago, it is said, generally singly, but none have been seen now for several generations. Indians come across their bones occasionally, and the narrator said that he and some others a few years ago came across a shoulder blade, which at first they thought was a peculiarly shaped rock sticking out of the ground, and this was on top of a mountain near the Highland River. The shoulder blade was as wide as a table, about 3 feet or a metre long, and was covered in several inches of moss. That is fascinating, as it hints that there may be memories of mammoths in indigenous American tradition. Although what Adrienne's work suggests is that there could be a principle that where large bones were exposed, people tried to explain them. Now, the stories about these bones differ in different regions and cultures. For example, underground mice to people-eating monsters. And the more exciting and interesting these stories, the more likely they are to be continued and retold. But here in the story, the notes, does this mean that mammoth memories are being recalled here? Did people remember mammoths? And this is not a stupid question. There is a serious side to this. For me, can I say that Siberian folklore preserves a continuous oral memory of the living animal passed down for thousands of years? Well, I think that is unlikely. First we must remember that mammoths disappeared from Siberia at the end of the Pleistocene, thousands of years ago. The traditions we have been discussing were recorded from the 17th century onwards. That is a gap of, say, thousands of years, and there is no attested transmission chain across that period, across Siberia or North America or Canada or Europe. There is not a tradition of mammoth stories, but it certainly doesn't mean there wasn't. Second, and probably more decisively, is that if these traditions were memories of a living animal, we would expect them to describe a living animal, an enormous hairy creature that walked about on the surface in herds with a trunk, which ate vegetation and which could be hunted, and which certainly wasn't a human-eating beast. And none of these stories describe this creature. Instead, they talk of an animal that's never been seen alive, that cannot survive the daylight, that lives beneath the ground, and is known only from its remains found in the mud of riverbanks. And, as I say, in some stories, it eats people. That is not a memory. That is an inference-based sort of idea based on the absence of memory. The traditions suggest that nobody has ever seen this animal alive, and so the evidence weighs on the side of the conclusion. But there is a third point I want to raise, and that is that the matter of what actually persists in oral tradition over such time spans. This is what I specialise in, and this is where we do need to be careful. There are some serious arguments we have that oral traditions can preserve information about the landscape and events across long periods, that the core structures of stories can persist, even if the details change. This is what I research, and such stories exist, and I do believe we have stories whose structures have existed for tens of thousands of years. Their details change to remain relevant, but the core of the story remains. If there were stories about mammoths, then the mammoths would have been replaced by something recognisable as the living creatures became extinct and so were no longer relevant to stories. Instead, new stories were created to explain the remains. Now, these stories are fascinating because they're describing an animal that never existed, the underground giant mouse. These stories do not contain a memory or details of a living animal, and whatever else they are definitely not doing that. And so I could have just started this video by saying, no, we have no evidence that humans have seen live mammoths, and saved you 15 minutes and a good cup of tea. But this is not the interesting part of the research. The interesting part of the research reveals a story of how humans create folklore, and now they have done this independently across great distances and time for the same thing. This all came from seeing the physical remains of a creature that they had never seen alive. They had no concept of extinction or deep time, and so they had to reason. They produced a hypothesis that accounted for the available evidence, that made testable predictions, and that were genuinely confirmed by every subsequent discovery. Yes, they were wrong about the animal, but they were not wrong about the method used to understand what it was, and the myths that resulted should not be considered a failure to remember the mammoth. They are a record of how humans in the past thought. Now, before I wrap this video up, thanking you for pressing that like button, which I'm sure you have, that really helps, rather than posit a conclusion, because there is one loose end here that I want to go over, that I haven't been able to answer for good. So the question I will leave with rather than conclusion, and I have to admit this, is that the mammoths did not go extinct all at once. Isolated populations survived long after mainland extinction, the most famous being on Wrangel Island in the Arctic Ocean, north of the Siberian coast, where mammoths persisted until around 4,000 years ago. That is not deep history. That is the Bronze Age. While these last mammoths were on Wrangel Island, there were cities in Mesopotamia. There was writing. The pyramids of Giza were already old. Now, Wrangel Island is remote. Its mammoth population was small and isolated, and there is no evidence I'm aware of humans ever visiting the island, interacting with the mammoths. But it sits there as a fact, and it makes the question of the last mammoth strange in a way that makes it enticing to ponder the improbable. The animal we treat as the emblem of the Ice Age outlived the invention of writing. And somewhere on a cold island, the last one died, and it died within the span of recorded human history, and yet nobody wrote it down. That is not a mystery that can be solved. There is nothing to find. But it does mean that when we ask, did anyone remember the mammoth, we are asking a question which was resolvable in the past. But what we have instead is a memory of a tusk in a riverbank and the stories that were built around it. And I think, in a way, that is better inheritance for folklore and its myths. A memory of a mammoth would only have told us about the mammoth. It is a depiction. These stories, the stories I've told today, well, these stories tell us about us. Hello, and if you're still here, I want to thank all my YouTube members and patrons who are whizzing up the screen right now. These have all helped support the channel, which helps support my research, helps support the folklore database, and I'm truly grateful for the work we do, which is supports, well, we've had 350 universities, at least students, researchers, academics of these using the database, doing research from social sciences to mythology and folklore and many other things. So thank you for all your support. Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe. It means such a lot. And with that, please stay safe and well and take care. And I'll speak to you all very soon. Toodle pip.